spoilers ahead.
In 2015, Robert Eggers' The Witch divided audiences right down the middle. Some of the people who didn't like it had a problem with the language and the accents.
And thine enemy, and I'll lick the dust of thine earth.
I have understood not a single word that has come out of me father's mouth since we stepped off that big dirty bastard of a bird.
But for the most part, it was faulted for its ambiguity. People weren't sure if it was supernatural or psychological horror, which was weird for me because that's exactly what I loved about it.
2 points I want to make. First, Eggers spent 4 whole years researching every aspect of 17th century New England life to get it perfect. Second, Eggers was so heavily influenced by Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, he felt a large portion of The Witch reeked of it. So, given 4 years is a very long time, and given The Shining is considered a template of ambiguity in film, we can only conclude that the ambiguity in The Witch was intentional. So, to understand why he went to all this trouble on his first ever movie, we're going to look at The Witch twice. First from a supernatural angle, then from a psychological one. Let's go.
The plot.
The Witch is a story about a family whose deep emotional wounds are drawn out by supernatural forces.
It's the 1630s in New England, and an English settler named William and his family, wife Catherine, twins Jonas and Mercy, son Caleb, and daughter Thomason, have been banished from their Puritan settling because the rest of the colony refuses to tolerate William's prideful conceit any longer. But William believes the colonists to be false Christians. So, confident in God's goodwill and his own ability to survive independently, he sets up a home front on the fringe of a nearby forest. After they've settled, Catherine has a 5th child named Samuel. And while he's under his sister Thomason's care, he's snatched away by a witch, who recognized the child as being unbaptized. So his body's used to make a flying ointment. And Samuel's disappearance devastates Catherine, who spends her days praying and crying over Samuel's hellish fate. With winter looming and his crops now failing, William's got no choice but to take Caleb into the woods behind Catherine's back so they can hunt for food. And while they're out, Caleb admits he's terrified he'll end up in hell as Samuel did, as his sins haven't been forgiven since they left the colony. Not wanting to upset his son, William sidesteps the subject and confides in Caleb that he secretly traded Catherine's silver cup for hunting supplies, and that everything's going to be okay. But when a sinister hare presents itself, William's gun mysteriously malfunctions, leaving them without food another night. Later that night, Catherine blames Thomason for stealing the cup and losing the baby intentionally. Her father defends her, but admits to nothing himself. After that, Thomason overhears them talking about giving her away to another family, as was often done at the time. The next day, when Thomason and Caleb sneak into the forest to check the trap, the dog bolts off after the evil hare. So Caleb bolts off after the dog. And spooked by the witch's presence, the horse tosses Thomason to the ground, knocking her unconscious. And while Thomason's out, Caleb gets lost in the woods. When he finds the dog, it's been gutted. And then he crosses paths with the Witch of the Wood, who lures him in with a deceptive, youthful appearance. William finds Thomason and brings her home, but Catherine's furious she took Caleb into the woods in the first place. So William's forced to reveal he's been taking Caleb into the woods himself, and it was him that took her cup. When Caleb eventually finds his way home, he's under the witch's curse. So he's taken inside, where Catherine resorts to bloodletting to release the evil. Following morning, the twins have taken to singing songs with Black Phillip, the family goat, and they accuse Thomason of witchcraft, possibly to distract their parents from their own connection to black magic. When Thomason tries milking one of the goats that afternoon, the curse that spoiled the crops has turned the milk to blood too. And then Caleb wakes up delirious, and the witch's apple exits his mouth. So Catherine instructs everybody to pray, but the curse blocks the twins' ability to recall even the Lord's Prayer. Then Caleb professes his love to Jesus as if he were looking him right in the eye, before he's taken into heaven. In light of the events, William tells Thomason she'll stand trial for witchcraft when they get back to the settlement. So Thomason points out his own hypocrisy and suggests the twins are in league with Black Phillip, the devil in goat form. Shocked at the recognition of his own sin, William nails everybody into the goat barn, before breaking down and confessing his sin of pride, begging God to save his children. And that night, the witch swoops in to drink blood from the goat before she sets upon the twins. And while all that's happening, Catherine's presented with a false image of Caleb alive and holding Samuel. She believes she's feeding the baby, but in reality, the devil's deceiving her in her weakened state. When William wakes up, the witch has torn the barn apart and eviscerated the goats. The twins are missing, and Thomason's framed by the evil forces behind the slaughter. And as she's waking up, Black Phillip further isolates her by finishing William off, burying him ironically under the fruits of his own labors. Convinced Thomason's the witch, Catherine attacks her, forcing Thomason to kill her own mother in self-defense. Left completely alone and guilty of every sin under the Puritan Christian sun, Thomason asks Black Phillip to speak to her, and when he does, she's offered a life of luxury in exchange for a simple signature in his book. She then disrobes and follows Black Phillip into the forest, where she joins a circle of naked women during one of their Sabbaths. As the women begin to levitate, she joins them in pure bliss, fully happy, free of burden for the first time in her life, outside the grace of God, in the company of witches.
And there you have it, The Witch as a supernatural story. Let me tell you, dramatic voiceovers sure do hurt the throat. Let's compare the supernatural with the psychological now.
The plot.
This time, The Witch is a story about a family whose deep emotional wounds are drawn out by their belief in supernatural forces.
In the 1630s, an English settler named William and his family have been kicked out of their Puritan colony because William's an arrogant know-it-all who's been rubbing the God-fearing colonists the wrong way. So instead of taking a moment of introspection, William doubles down out of spite and drags his whole family from the safety of the colony into the untamed wild of New England. And after they've settled, Catherine has a fifth child named Samuel. One morning, while Thomason's looking after the baby out in the wild, it goes missing.
The colonists left England in hopes of leaving the terrors of the devil behind, but of course they brought their beliefs along with them. For them, dark magic was a real thing, and the devil was a legitimate threat to your life. They also believed in witches and that they wanted to harm you.
Right after Samuel is taken, we're shown the witch doing something very common in witch lore with the flying ointment. But in the following scene, Caleb wakes Thomason from a nightmare.
Remember that.
Naturally, Catherine's destroyed by Samuel's disappearance, but William sees this as a threat to his ego. He's losing kids left, right, and center, and his crops are rotting right before winter. The last thing a man with an ego wants is proof he's incapable. So he takes Caleb into the forest behind Catherine's back to hunt for food instead, putting his ego before honesty. In the forest, William assures his son everything's gonna be fine, because he's got all this fancy new hunting equipment now. And 30 seconds later, when an innocent hare wanders by, William's ego takes another knock when he proves he's no better at hunting food than he is at growing it. And later that night, exhausted and starving, Catherine accuses Thomason of stealing the cup and losing baby Samuel through negligence, the latter of which is probably true. William tries defending her, but Catherine's sights are set on giving Thomason away now that she's developing into womanhood and probably catching the eye of the men in the family.
Ew.
Thomason has no riding experience, so she falls off the horse as soon as it speeds up. And while she's unconscious, we're shown what's happening to Caleb in the forest. But the camera cuts back and forth constantly between the siblings. And that's Eggers implying a connection between them even though Thomason's asleep. Caleb tries whistling, but no sound comes out. Then he happens upon the witch, who's young and beautiful. It's all very dreamlike. Then it cuts back to William finding Thomason and asking her what happened to Caleb. When she hears the question, it cuts right back to what's happening to him, but it's actually cutting back to what she fears happened to him. We see the continuation of what she just conjured up in her terrified teenage Puritan mind. When Caleb eventually finds his own way home, he's naked and sick and delirious with red stains around his mouth. Out of desperation, Catherine turns to bloodletting, which was common back then for almost everything they couldn't understand medically. And probably out of sheer boredom, the energetic twins start singing songs about the family goat. Then, without a real understanding of the weight of their accusations, they tattle on Thomason for being a witch, the way your brother or sister might have tattled on you for sneaking cookies before dinner. And when Thomason milks the goat and sees the blood, it was probably mastitis, which is a very common goat udder problem that can result from, you guessed it, eating fungus from spoiled crops. And when Caleb regains consciousness, out pops the partially digested apple, which is clearly rotten and very small, given he'd fit the whole thing in his mouth and he's only a child. And he'd mentioned seeing an apple tree earlier in the story. Perhaps he found it again. And given the level of everyone's hunger, he probably ate too many of them. Or they weren't the edible kind, which could very well have poisoned him at such a young age, especially if he'd eaten all the seeds as well. William flat out accuses Thomasin of being a witch. So knowing she's not one, but believing everything's happening because of the devil, she's no choice but to attribute it to the devil. So she connects the twins to Black Phillip. Now a self-doubting, weakened man, William locks everyone up until his ego takes over again. And now it's him causing all of this. He's responsible. His arrogance shines through the brightest when he actually grants God his permission to do away with them, as though God would need his permission. That night, the third time we're shown the witch happens to coincide with the third time Thomasin's asleep in the movie. William's a few feet away in the main cabin, and there's a quick establishing shot showing us how eerily still and quiet everything is. So Eggers is pointing out there's no way William would have missed the screaming twins or Thomasin shouting or the witch herself cackling, meaning the entire experience happens in Thomasin's head again. And while that's happening, Catherine, who's severely sleep deprived and starving and delirious from loss, simply hallucinates. And if she'd been forced to consume any of the rotten crops to avoid starvation, it's no secret some of those rotting crops are known to produce funguses that can cause side effects very similar to an LSD trip.
Which is probably what happened in Salem. Look it up.
The next morning, William sees the overnight damage caused by Black Phillip, who was probably agitated by the sudden addition of 3 children to his sleeping space, given that goats are prone to demonstrating dominance in social groups. And while William's distracted, the riled-up goat has a final go at him. And after the final fight with Catherine, Thomasin falls asleep again. And this time, she dreams of her only means of escaping the inevitable punishment awaiting her. Had the movie have continued beyond the ecstasy and elation she experienced in the closing scene, Thomasin would have woke up to the most horrible reality a Puritan child could ever imagine. With no home, no family, no God, and a murderer.
And there you have it, the plot to The Witch through rational eyes.
And if you thought The Witch was ambiguous, consider how ambiguous 17th century life was. By the end of the movie, if you weren't sure what actually destroyed this family, you're right where you're supposed to be, under Robert Eggers' spell.
Instead of making his antagonist Jaws or Michael Myers, Robert Eggers is asking you to decide whether or not the supernatural activity occurred in real life or just up in their heads. Was this movie named after some dark, forest-dwelling, supernatural agent of evil? Or was it just another label that we human beings use to punish and alienate people we don't understand? And the answer to that, I don't think is ambiguous. I think it's up to us to decide. Personally, I think that's pretty freaking cool. Not now, I am doing YouTube. Until next time, folks. It's me, Johnny, from that thing you just watched. If you enjoyed it, go down there and smash me in the face to subscribe. And if you want to watch another thing, there's one right there. Do it!